Bro, imagine being a Japanese peasant during the Bakumatsu era and seeing a fleet of white men just pull up on you. Evaluate the extent. Episode 1. How did revolutions lead to social and cultural progress? What is it with like the College Board and always asking questions that open with evaluate the extent to which blah 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 blah. Like it's such a weird way to phrase a question. I never really understood it. Anyways, I'm your host Vincent. Pleased to meet you. And today we're going to be talking about how several revolutions were attempted and, to various degrees of success, changed the cultural and social status quo. We're going to open with how the Meiji Restoration shows how more traditional cultures seek to preserve their way of life while also adapting to the new trend of industrialization. But some others, such as the Ottoman Empire, failed to industrialize and collapsed as a result. Sakoku was an isolationist policy formed by the Tokugawa shogunate, limiting trade and interactions between Japan and foreign countries. Nearly all foreign nationals were banned from entering the island, and no Japanese citizens were allowed out. And the Seclusion Edict made this very, very clear. No Japanese ship, nor any native of Japan, shall presume to go out of the country. Whoever acts contrary to this shall die, and the ship with the crew and the goods aboard shall be sequestered until further orders. All persons who return from abroad shall be put to death. Yeah, I think you get the idea. The reason for this period of extensive isolation was to remove the colonial and religious influence primarily from Spain and Portugal, and the increasing number of Catholic converts south of the island were seen as a threat to the existing power of the shogunate. In July of 1853, U.S. Commodore Matthew C. Perry's squadron arrived in Uraga on an American diplomatic mission that aimed to end the Japanese policy of isolation, opening Japanese ports to American trade. Imagine being one of those peasants in that time period and just seeing that happen. Like an industrialized station pulling up on you with like people you've never seen before and they don't look like you. This day became known as the arrival of the Black Ships, referring to the industrialized warships that the US Navy brought along with them. Seeing this, the Japanese were motivated to modernize and rapidly industrialize because they saw the power of other countries. The Chinese, for example, were facing unequal treaties and losing the Opium War, causing them to pay reparations. And them seeing the Chinese became servants to foreigners, they did not want this to happen to them. They had to open up to the West. And the Meiji Restoration took action to modernize. When it came to industrialization, Japan and Britain actually had a lot in common. Because once Japan opened its seaports to outside trade, they began to develop a very strong navy, similar to the one that allowed Britain to expand rapidly during the Industrial Revolution, and Japan managed to modernize in less than 100 years. And by raising agricultural tax, the state was able to sponsor industrialization and westernization efforts. That led to the eventual elimination of the shogunate and reinstation of the Japanese emperor, who previously had only existed as a spiritual and symbolic figure. This, of course, was a shock to the entire national community because Japan was able to change its entire social structure in order to industrialize, industrializing in less than 100 years. They started as a feudal society with the shogunate, but transformed into an egalitarian meritocracy. They became almost equal to England in their power. As industrialization spread, each country experienced competing pressures between preservation of their traditional values and modernization. The Ottoman Empire, on the other hand, did not adapt to Western ideas. Post World War I, the Ottoman Empire collapsed and was replaced by the Republic of Turkey as well as several other independent nations. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. In the late 1700s, the Ottoman Empire was constantly at war. This, of course, called for reforms known as the Tanzimat, as well as the end of the old regime period. Tanzimat reforms focused on modernizing the empire, but these reforms desired to keep the socio-political foundations Ottoman society was built on. That's not to mention the Crimean War as well as the whole Armenians thing. Genocide is kind of a big deal, and I don't have enough time today to discuss it in a way not to gloss over, and I don't have enough time to give it what it properly deserves. So, yeah, considering the time constraints, I will be summarizing the Armenian genocide as it relates to the Ottoman Empire, but I will leave out certain details just for the sake of time and clarity. Okay, so with that disclaimer out of the way, where was I? Numerous revolts and a steady rivalry with Russia led to a loss of territories throughout the 19th and earliest 20th centuries, along with rampant corruption and ethnic nationalism being on the rise, led to the downfall of the Ottoman Empire. My main point is that the Ottoman Empire did not adopt Western ideas, and this led to the steady downfall, because traditional societies, in order to preserve their culture, must adapt to industrialization in order to survive. Part 2: The Latin American Revolution. During the Latin American Revolution, even though independence was gained from Spain/Portugal, their influence in the colonies and the racial hierarchy remained. The caste system decided your place in society. And with miscegenation, they made specific rules for everyone. If you were born to a Spaniard and a native, you were mestizo. If you were born to a Spaniard and a black person, you were mulatto. And at the bottom of the pyramid were zambos, those born to black and indigenous parents. If you had darker skin, you were looked down on by society. If you were of mulatto descent and married a native, your child was called a salta atrás, literally translating to a step back. And if you think that's racist, know that one of the lowest rankings for a Zambo was called a no te entiendo, which translates to I don't understand you. This racial hierarchy still exists to this day. My parents are both Salvadoran, both identify as mestizo. In El Salvador, black people aren't allowed citizenship. The Constitution of El Salvador explicitly prohibits the immigration and settlement of black people in the country. And Costa Rica, Guatemala, and Panama also have similar laws against especially Afro Caribbeans claiming citizenship. Discrimination at the state level is also why many indigenous groups in Central America isolate their communities, similar to what Japan did with Sakoku. The Latin American Revolution lasted from 1810 to 1825, with political causes being that all the power belonged to peninsulares, serving as viziers, administrators, and judges, and the colonies had no history of self-governance. And European nations were using mercantilism to gain wealth from the colonies by exploiting labor from especially indigenous people and black slaves. Simon Bolivar is considered the most important military leader in this struggle for independence, especially in South America. Born in Venezuela, he led military forces there, as well as in Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia. Bolivar's plan to unite Ecuador, Venezuela, Peru, Bolivia, and Colombia was called Gran Colombia. They united in 1822 but broke apart because in 1830 because mountains physically separated them. And Bolivar hoped that it would be a workable union for all Latin American states. He was a Creole leader. And in this time period, Creoles, those born, it was Spaniards born in the Americas, they had all the political power. And from 1811 to 1824, Bolivar led an armed revolution against Spain. And despite all of this, despite one of the main reasons for the revolution being power for minorities, especially indigenous people, Creoles still remained in power for many years after that, and the racial hierarchy system still remains to this day. This also led to the dependence on the United States to protect Latin American countries from European nations, and that reliance still remains to this day. After the Latin American Revolution, Brazil didn't even abolish slavery, and Creoles replaced peninsulares as the absolute power force.